The great colossal monuments of the ancient world. We often have the pyramids of Egypt come to mind, and rightly so. But a curious mind may find itself traveling a little way east, where something interesting awaits. Out on the flat plains of ancient Mesopotamia, great structures were built 4,000 years ago by long-dead kingdoms. Man-made mountains of sun-baked brick and glittering glazed tiles soaring into the skies above. But it's not a pyramid. This is a ziggurat, a terraced temple tower built to bridge earth and heaven. In the Bronze Age Near East, nearly every major city boasted of one of these towering monuments dedicated to the local patron god. They were as emblematic to Mesopotamian city-states as the pyramids were to Egypt. Yet today, the ziggurats remain the lesser known, truly forgotten wonders of the ancient world. Their eroded ruins appear as gigantic mounds of mud brick, ghosts of their former glory, overshadowed in popular memory by Egyptian pyramids or classical monuments. But in their own time, ziggurats were unrivaled feats of engineering and spirituality, anchoring the religious and civic life of those great Mesopotamian cities. So perhaps today, the best way to remember the ziggurats is to learn about them. Tell all of your friends about those forgotten monuments. Good news is, I'm here to walk you through it. So welcome to the channel. If you're a newcomer, really good to meet you. I hope you enjoy the introduction and know what you're in for the next hour. But what you are not in for is ads, because there's no ads on the channel. You won't get any interruptions from start to finish, and that's good news. We do this because it's better that way, and everybody hates ads. But we're able to do it because we're supported by those on the Patreon, the YouTube members, the occasional donation through PayPal and Super Thanks, and those who check out the merch store. Also, just your like, comment, subscribe, hit the hype button, tell your friends, all that sort of thing. So thank you very much in advance. Now, with that being said and introductions out of the way, let's get to the topic at hand, the ziggurats. So where exactly does it all start? Well, you have to go back quite a while for that, although we're not too precise with it. We do know that they emerge from a history of sacred high places. That the very word ziggurat comes from the Akkadian Zigguratu, meaning high or pinnacle, and that's a pretty apt description. Now, the concept of building an artificial mountain for worship also traces back to the Ubaid period. That is the 6th millennium BCE. So we're talking 8,000 years ago kind of thing. So quite a way back, as we said. Well, this time early temple platforms had first appeared in southern Mesopotamia. And as legend has it, the first Sumerians descended from the eastern highlands onto the river plains, carrying with them the idea of sacred mountains. Because the flat alluvial landscape had no natural hills, people began constructing raised platforms of mud to elevate their sanctuaries. By the Uruk period, 4th millennium BCE, nearly every city featured a large mud brick terrace as the base for a temple, which is effectively a prototype for the ziggurat. One famous early example is the White Temple of Uruk. We believe that was constructed around 3500 BCE. A whitewashed shrine perched atop a high platform of packed earth. During the early dynastic period, 3rd millennium BCE, I'll keep updating you with the approximate times for these periods as we go along, these platforms grew ever larger and more complex, evolving into true multi-tiered structures that are recognizable as ziggurats, though this definition, kind of like pyramids, is one of those where you will encounter ziggurats of different sizes and somewhat different shapes, styles, you see. But they are still ziggurats, just as we encounter pyramids in Egypt that might not be as tall as those at Giza, might not be as grand as Sneferu's pyramids, but they are, even though they are 20 feet tall, something like that, still pyramids. In any case, we're talking about ziggurats today. We won't go too off the topic. But we're at the earliest known ziggurat. Well, the one that we have discovered so far as the earliest known is Tepe Sialk in Iran, dated to around 2900, with a three-tiered mud brick structure that predates even the great ziggurats of Mesopotamia. By the 3rd millennium, ziggurats had become an established institution across Sumer, that is, southern Iraq. The cities of Eresh, Eridu, and Uruk all had step temple towers, attested in the archaeological record, or even a few texts that we have, and we do have quite a lot of texts from that time because they were all clay tablets, quite easy to store them. Kings of early dynastic cities took pride in enlarging and embellishing these sacred structures, and over time the tradition spread north and then east. Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, Elamites, even the Eblaites of ancient Syria built ziggurats or similar high temples for their own gods. And so in broad terms, the ziggurat really was a hallmark of Bronze Age urban civilization across the Near East, from roughly 3000 BCE until the end of the Bronze Age, which we place at around 1200 BCE with that collapse, and indeed into the Iron Age as well that followed it, all these monumental towers rising above city walls as visible symbols of a city's wealth, religious devotion, and ultimately technological prowess. But it is important to note that ziggurats were fundamentally Mesopotamian in origin. While ancient Egypt built pyramids around the same era, those were tombs. They weren't temples. So the ziggurats served a different function. Some historians have speculated that Egypt's earliest step pyramid, like King Djoser's step pyramid at Saqqara, built around 2600, may have been inspired by Mesopotamian ziggurats, or the general idea of having a stepped monument. Well, that is quite a point of argument. Whether or not that is true, the independent development of similar forms, a tiered, pyramid-like shape, it certainly speaks to a common impulse in early civilizations to create a sacred mountain of human construction, and I suppose a global desire to get as close to the sky as possible. However, the function and cultural context of ziggurats, that's the real distinction from the Egyptian pyramids, as we will go on to explain more. The ziggurat was not a royal tomb, but a living part of the city's ritual landscape. In Mesopotamia's Bronze Ages, to build a ziggurat was to stake a claim to fame, not just for the king, but for the city itself, honoring the gods, securing divine favor, believed to keep the city prosperous. By the late Bronze Age, the 2nd millennium BC, that is, ziggurats had reached truly colossal scale. They also appeared beyond Mesopotamia's heartland. For instance, the Elamite kingdom in what is now southwestern Iran, if we're going to put it in rough terms, built a magnificent ziggurat at modern-day Choga Zanbil. Around that time, in 1250 BC, was called Dur-Untash, and that demonstrated that even neighboring cultures had adopted this architectural form for their own deities. No, all be told, roughly 2 to 3 dozen ziggurats are known from archaeological remains or records, scattered across today's Iraq, Iran, and Syria. And each of them was unique. There was no one-size-fits-all, but they did share the same basic purpose, and that was to elevate the most sacred temple of the city high above the ground, bring it closer to that realm of the gods. But I know what you're thinking. How exactly do you build a giant mountain out of mud bricks 6,000 years ago? Good question. Certainly discussed around dinner tables worldwide most evenings. Mesopotamian engineers certainly rose to the challenge, and with remarkable ingenuity. Of course, there were feats of Bronze Age engineering, requiring organized labor, careful planning, and knowledge of materials. Typically, a ziggurat began as a broad rectangular or square platform, kind of like a giant stage, and then successive levels were added on top, each slightly smaller than the one below, and that's what creates that gradated, stepped pyramid profile. Most ziggurats had between 2 and 7 tiers. Smaller city ziggurats might have only had a few levels, while the largest ones achieved 7 terraces stacked high. But there wasn't a standard size. At the modest end, some early ziggurats were only a few meters tall, essentially just a raised foundation for a temple. But at the extreme end, like the ziggurat of Babylon, for example, which was called the Etemenanki. Yes, that's it, excuse me. They're recorded as soaring to the height of nearly 90 meters. Now put that into perspective, that's nearly as tall as a modern 20-story building. Of course, we will take a look at those claims later on, whether they truly reach that height or if the ancient sources exaggerated. We'll get to that later. But of course, the sky's the limit. Well, the core material for construction was the sun-dried mud brick, the staple of Mesopotamian architecture. Millions of these mud bricks, each about the size of a shoebox, and weighing around 33 pounds, about 15 kilograms, were molded from the silt of the Tigris and Euphrates, dried in the sun, and then laid in thick courses to form the ziggurat's bulk. One estimate for the great ziggurat of Ur is that it incorporated some 720,000 bricks just in its base level. Since ordinary sun-baked bricks were not very water-resistant, builders protected ziggurats' exteriors with a skin of fired brick. Now, these kiln-baked bricks were a little more advanced. Firstly, they were harder, but second of all, they often had glazing of different colors. They were set in bitumen mortar, which is a kind of natural asphalt, which acted as a waterproof cement. Impressively, excavations have found evidence of reed mat layers and drainage systems built into ziggurats, ancient techniques to add stability and channel rainwater off the structure. Herodotus, who was writing in the 5th century BCE, described the Babylonian ziggurats' construction. As they built up terraces, they would interpose layers, of wattled reeds every 30 courses of bricks, and used hot bitumen for cement. Now, this does match the archaeological findings of reed layers that likely helped bind the mud brick mass to prevent cracks from moisture. Certainly built to last, these ziggurats, that's for sure. Design elements of ziggurats were not only practical, but also aesthetic. The facades of many ziggurats were paneled or recessed, creating shadow and depth on the otherwise plain brick surfaces. And some ziggurats had their different levels painted or glazed in distinctive colors of their own. For example, Babylon's great ziggurat, which we mentioned briefly, was described in later sources as having 7 tiers, each associated with a planetary color. And that is a tradition that may have developed in the Neo-Babylonian era. It's hard to pinpoint such things. But even if color symbolism is uncertain, we do know kings often commissioned decorative glazed bricks. Deep blue, yellow, white, black glazes have been found, and that hints that at least parts of these towers gleamed with vivid hues under the Mesopotamian sun. Now, the very top stage was usually crowned with a temple shrine, a little more on that later, which might be painted or plated with metals. You can certainly imagine at dawn or dusk the sunlight catching a gilded shrine or golden statue atop a multicolored mountain of bricks. Pretty breathtaking. Even in our modern day breathtaking, but back then, yeah, you can imagine showing up from a village or something to the big city and seeing that ziggurat. Definitely something to behold. Now, as for access to the upper levels, that was provided by staircases or ramps, just in the artists' renditions in the pictures. The simplest ziggurats had a single grand staircase on one side leading straight up to the temple top. Other designs featured a triple staircase, two symmetrical flights rising from the lower court to mid-level, meeting at a landing, and a central flight continuing upward. The Great Ziggurat of Ur offers a classic example of this three-stairway design on its front face, a monumental staircase that has been reconstructed today. A few ziggurats, according to ancient sources, may have had a spiral ramp wrapping around the exterior. Herodotus claimed that the Babylonian ziggurat's ascent, quote, mounts spirally outside all the towers, and that indicates a kind of corkscrew path. No. Modern archaeologists and scholars debate if this was literally the case or just some kind of misunderstanding. There's a few of them within Herodotus' writings, but that's a story for another video, I suppose. Some Assyrian ziggurats in the north were built against citadel walls and likely accessed via sloping ramps. Regardless of the configuration, the climb was steep and ceremonial. It was certainly not your casual walk. Halfway up, there might be a rest area or a gatehouse. In Babylon, Herodotus noted a halting place with seats for repose at the midpoint of the journey at the top. And it's pretty telling, too, that kings loved to stamp their names on the very bricks of their ziggurats. Thousands of bricks from sites like Ur, Uruk, Larsa, and Babylon bear royal inscriptions. You can find ones like, I, King so-and-so, built this ziggurat for the god so-and-so, things like that. And it served as both a dedication but also a perpetual record of the builder. One such inscription from Ur-Nammu, the Sumerian king of Ur, the 21st century BCE, has been found on clay cones and bricks. Quote, For Nanna, the mighty lord of Ur, Ur-Nanna, the king, built his temple and raised it as high as a mountain. Now, similarly, decades, well, rather centuries later, Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon of the 6th century BCE recorded of Etemenanke, quote, I made it the wonder of the people of the world. I raised its top to the heavens. I built doors of cedar for the gates and covered it with bitumen and bricks. Now these words, pressed into clay, let us hear the voices of rulers boasting of their ziggurat projects. The task was certainly immense. That is by no means an overestimation. It likely required corvée labor from thousands, digging clay, molding bricks, hauling them up the growing tower, and securing them with hot tar. I'm sure there were no easy jobs, but I would not be putting my hand up for the hot tar or the hauling of bricks, that's for sure. Laborers toiled in the fierce sun, while overseers checked alignments and priests performed rituals at each stage of construction to sanctify the work. Building a ziggurat was as much of a religious undertaking as an engineering one. The first brick and the final capstone were laid with ceremonies to invoke the blessing of the god. But despite this careful construction, unfortunately, time has not been as kind to Ziggurats. Mud brick, water, and a few thousand years do not mix well. Without constant maintenance, rain and wind ate away at the brickwork. Many Ziggurats had outer casings of baked brick that were periodically repaired by later kings. Yet eventually, as dynasties fell and cities were abandoned, these massive towers began to crumble. The baked bricks were often plundered in antiquity to build new houses or fortifications elsewhere. Recycling building material is quite an old practice. Left exposed, the softer mud brick cores eroded into giant lumps, and this is why today most ziggurat sites appear as low, eroded monuments, mere shadows of their original heights. It's also why archaeological evidence of the topmost shrine is scarce. The summit levels were typically the first to disappear. Still, the very size of the ziggurats ensured that something remained. You don't get rid of something so big so easily. Early explorers in the 19th century were astonished to find huge man-made hills in the Iraqi desert. They soon realized that they were the stage towers that were described by those ancient writers. So really, the construction of a ziggurat was a bold statement, and even in the Bronze Age, humans could shape the environment on a monumental scale. Using simple materials, mud, reeds, tar, wood, and organized human effort, they built structures that rivaled natural hills in size and durability. The design of receding levels gave ziggurats a distinctive geometric beauty and structural stability, and although they have mostly melted back into the earth, we do have enough that survives for us to appreciate this technical sophistication. Well, now we know how ziggurats were built, but we must ask why. What purpose did they solve in the spiritual life of ancient Mesopotamians? Of course, they were not just monuments or watchtowers. They were deeply sacred structures. To the people of the Bronze Age Near East, a ziggurat was essentially a man-made holy mountain. Its role was to support the house of the city's god high above the ordinary world. But unlike a pyramid that entombs a dead pharaoh, a ziggurat elevates the sanctuary of a living deity. Well, on the height of on the flat Mesopotamian plain, rather, height itself had sacred significance. The higher you go, the closer to the heavens and the divine realm. The Mesopotamians believed that their gods often dwelled on mountaintops or in the highest of the heavens. In Sumerian cosmology, for instance, the god Enlil ruled from a mountain-like temple called Kur, the house of the mountain in the city of Nippur. Since most cities had no real mountains, the ziggurat was a symbolic mountain, a focal point where heaven and earth met. And that's kind of a testament to the human ingenuity. If we don't have any mountains, we're going to make one. Well, at the summit of the ziggurat stood the temple or shrine, typically small, but a richly decorated building. This was the actual house of the god, called the temple, meaning house of, following the god's name or epithet, so Nana, Ishtar, this kind of thing. It was here that the deity's statue would reside and where the high priests or priestess would perform daily rituals, and this is, of course, out of the public view. Herodotus, when he describes the top of the shrine at the Babylonian ziggurat, notes that inside, quote, a great bed is laid, and a golden table set beside it, but no statue, and that a lone chosen woman would stay there at night, as if awaiting the god's presence. This likely alludes to rituals of divine marriage, or the belief that the god would descend from the heavens to visit the shrine. In the case of Babylon's temple of Marduk atop Etemenanke, other sources tell us that the statue of Bel or Marduk actually dwelled in a ground-level temple nearby called the Esagila, while the top of the ziggurat may have been left more as a ritual chamber furnished for the god's occasional presence. Whether or not a permanent idol stood in each ziggurat's summit shrine, the concept was pretty clear. The ziggurat was a literal stairway for the god to come down and receive worship, and for priests to symbolically ascend into that divine sphere. The concept of bridging realms is beautifully reflected in the Sumerian names of some of the ziggurats. For example, the great ziggurat of Babylon, as we've mentioned, was called Etemenanke, which in Sumerian means temple of the foundation of heaven and earth. Likewise, the ziggurat of the moon god Nana at Ur was named Temenigur, variously translated as house whose foundations creates or house of the foundation platform of heaven and earth. These names convey the idea that the very foundation of the ziggurat is anchored in the earth, while its top reaches the heavens. One Mesopotamian text even poetically describes a ziggurat terrace as being like a white cloud in the midst of heaven. In a hymn attributed to King Ur-Nammu, the king boasts, quote, "I have built the temple for my lord Nana. As if it were verdant hillside, I set up its towers in a great place." The ziggurat is indeed likened to a lush hill, interestingly suggesting that they may have planted gardens or sod on the slopes, or at least that it was seen as an imitation mountain. But what about functionally? Well, functionally they were part of a larger temple complex. Typically at the ziggurat's base there sprawled a courtyard and a cluster of buildings, storage rooms, workshops, priests' quarters, kitchens for preparing offerings, and maybe a peppering of lesser shrines. As for ordinary citizens, they did not climb the ziggurat or enter the top shrine. That domain was sacred to the god and accessible only to the priesthood. Instead, the populace participated in ceremonies in the courtyard or surrounding streets, especially on festival days. And so we might picture a New Year festival in Babylon, with processions carrying statues of gods up the ziggurat's steps, or a sacrificial offering of a bull on an altar at the ziggurat's foot, with smoke wafting upward. The height of the ziggurat also had practical advantages. It could serve as a refuge from the periodic floods that inundated Mesopotamia's lowlands, preserving the cult paraphernalia from water damage. Some scholars note that by restricting access via a few narrow stairways, the ziggurat allowed priests to conduct rites in privacy and safety, perched above any prying eyes or potential disturbances below. Just pure concentration. And so in this sense, the ziggurat guaranteed sanctity and security. It was a protected, elevated stage for communion between gods and priests. The symbolism for the ziggurat as a cosmic mountain also intersects with broader mythology. For Mesopotamians, mountains were seen as sacred abodes of gods. Now consider how in the old stories, like Epic of Gilgamesh, the gods convene on Mount Mashu, or how Utnapishtim's ark comes to rest on a mountaintop after the flood, signifying salvation on high ground. The ziggurat provided each city with its own Mount Zion, so to speak, a holy high place, right in the center for all to see. I suppose you could argue that daily sight of their ziggurat reminded people that their patron deity literally watched over them. And it was the pride of the city, a source of identity. A Babylonian hymn might say, "O Ziggurat, gleaming mountain of the Lord's heaven and earth bond, provider of the people's abundance. indicating that well-being of the city was tied to the proper maintenance of that sacred tower. Conversely, when foreign conquerors came, they sometimes targeted ziggurats for destruction as a way to break the spirit of those in the city. The Assyrian king Sennacherib, for instance, bragged that he destroyed Babylon's ziggurat in 689 during a punitive campaign, a sacrilegious act meant to humble the god of Babylon, that being Marduk. But critically speaking, modern archaeology has had to piece together the function of ziggurats from pretty scant evidence. It's not like we have a manual from Mesopotamian priests explaining what the rituals were like. But we do have a few clues. First, we have Herodotus' account. We have later classical writers, the Hebrew Bible story of the Tower of Babel, and numerous cuneiform texts that list offerings or dedications to temple towers. Now, these sources sometimes mix reverence with a dose of skepticism or polemic. For example, the Bible's famous narratives in Genesis 11 imagine a humanity at Babylon building their tower with its top in the heavens out of arrogance, and God coming down and confounding their language to stop them. This reflects in part the outsider's view, likely much later, that such grand edifices could symbolize human pride. But from the Mesopotamian perspective, raising a ziggurat was not hubris, but it was piety. It was the proper way to honor and house the divine. The truth may be that the ziggurat embodied both ambitions, the spiritual aspiration to reach the divine and the political assertion of a city's importance, and in that dual role it is little wonder that these towers became the stuff of legend, and that's not just within Mesopotamia, but far beyond. Of course, the awe that was inspired by the ziggurats certainly is seen in later memory, but also ancient literature. And perhaps the most well-known is that biblical story of the Tower of Babel. Though composed long after the Bronze Age, we'll give it that, likely during the first millennium BC, the story is set in the mists of the primordial time of the city of Babel. Now, if you didn't catch it, that's Babylon. It narrates a story of how all humans speaking one tongue unite to build a city and a tower, quote, whose top may reach unto heaven. Well, God, seeing their overweening project, confused their language and scattered them. So the tower remained unfinished and the place was called Babel, linked etymologically to confusion. But this story is almost certainly taking its inspiration from the real ziggurat of Babylon, Etemenanke, which, by the way, by the time of the Hebrew exile in Babylon, which was about 6th century BC, stood in ruins awaiting completion. The Bible's authors recast the Great Tower as a cautionary tale of human pride versus the will of God. Yet, ironically, the very inclusion of that story in Genesis ensured that the fame of Mesopotamia's ziggurats endured in the Western cultural memory, well, albeit in distorted form. Well, to this day, the Tower of Babel conjures an image of a skyscraping edifice and a linguistic confusion, both rooted in the fate of a ziggurat. Mesopotamian sources themselves also preserve legends. A remarkable Babylonian text, known later as the Borsippa inscription, or a cylinder of Nebuchadnezzar, recounts an older tower that a former king had built, but not finished, whose head or the top was never completed because people abandoned it, not caring for their words. Nebuchadnezzar then describes how he restored this structure to its glory. This has an uncanny resonance with the Babel story, even mentioning an ancient stoppage of work and a confusion of speech. Borsippa was a city near Babylon, by the way, that had its own ziggurat, which was called Ermenenanke. It seems that the Babylonians themselves had a memory of a dilapidated ziggurat from antiquity, possibly dating back to the second millennium, when we don't know. But in any case, it seems to have stood incomplete for ages. Early Babylonian historians, like Berosus from the 3rd century BCE, later wrote of a great tower built in Babylonia and a subsequent scattering of peoples, indicating that the tale of an abandoned ziggurat project was part of local lore and had filtered down into various cultural traditions. Greek visitors to Mesopotamia in the centuries after the Bronze Age were likewise quite struck by the ziggurats. Herodotus, in his histories written around 440, gives quite a detailed description of the, quote, Tower of Zeus Belus at Babylon, which is, of course, unmistakably the ziggurat of Etemenanke. It's just that the Greeks and Romans would usually put things into terms that they could understand. If you would say something like Nannar or the king of the gods, they would just say, oh, we know what you mean, you're talking about Zeus. That's kind of like what it is. In any case, Herodotus describes a square base, nearly about 200 meters long in length, upon which stood a solid tower with 7 successive towers atop of it, reaching a total of 8 levels. Now that sounds like a ziggurat, if there ever was one. An exterior stair or ramp spiraled upwards, with a rest stop midway. At the summit, he recounts, there was a shrine with a large bed and golden table, but as we mentioned, no statue, implying perhaps that the god's presence was actually invisible. He even mentions that the Chaldean priests told him, though he professes a bit of skepticism, that the god himself came to the shrine when night fell. Well, in any case, skepticism notwithstanding, accounts like that certainly fire up the imagination of classical readers. Later Greek authors like Diodorus Siculus and Strabo also mention the great towers of Mesopotamia, albeit they sometimes confuse a few details. Now you see, by then, many ziggurats were already in ruin due to the Persian and Hellenistic neglect. But their fame as ancient, enormous towers was something that could not so easily crumble. One pretty delightful historical anecdote comes from the campaigns of Alexander the Great. You see, when he conquered Babylon in 331, he marveled at its dilapidated ziggurat and resolved to restore it to its former glory. The chroniclers say that Alexander ordered 10,000 soldiers to clear the rubble of the collapsed tower in preparation for rebuilding. Well, they toiled for weeks, removing tens of thousands of bricks. However, when Alexander returned to Babylon some years later, he was a little disappointed. There wasn't much progress. It seems that the project itself was daunting, even for an army of men. Well, he was undeterred, though. He personally oversaw renewed efforts to rebuild the ziggurat. But sadly, or perhaps fatefully, Alexander died in Babylon 323 BCE, with the ziggurat still unfinished, and his successors never carried on the plan. In fact, a Babylonian chronicle called the, quote, Ruin of Esagila Chronicle relates to decades later, in frustrations, one of Alexander's successor actually leveling the remaining stump of the Etemenanke for safety. Thus, by 300 BC, that glorious Tower of Babel had been entirely reduced to footings, ending an architectural legacy that had begun some 1,500 years before with its initial construction. This tale of Alexander's failed restoration shows how legendary the ziggurat was. Even the world's greatest conqueror yearned to rebuild it, and how even he found it beyond repair. It's a shame, though. Maybe we still have time. Let's build a ziggurat. Maybe I'll start a GoFundMe. Right, we'll all get a big plot of land out there somewhere. We'll build a giant ziggurat, and we'll all live happily ever after. And this time, everyone's allowed to go up to the top. That's a good rule. Well, through all these examples, whether it be biblical, Babylonian, or Greek, I think we can certainly agree that ziggurats straddle that line between history and myth. So impressive that later generations wove stories around them, attributing them to demigods or primeval men. And because they often fell into disrepair, the mystery of their ruins invited explanation. For instance, local folklore in Iraq long associated certain mounds with the biblical Nimrod or other figures. The ziggurat of Borsippa is still called Birs Nimrud by locals, which links it to the old god Nimrod, the mighty hunter who in lore built Babel's tower. Now that keeps the memory alive, that's for sure. But amid all the myths, we do have a few authentic voices from the Bronze Age that call out to us. Now, these are in the well-preserved cuneiform tablets and cylinders. We can read the words of the very kings who built these wonders. Sumerian rulers like Gudea of Lagash, around 2120, left inscriptions about constructing temples, quote, the likes of which no one had seen. King Shulgi of Ur, around 2050 BCE, wrote hymns praising his ziggurat as making Nana rejoice. The texts often emphasize piety and the well-being of the land. By building the god's lofty house, the king ensured that the god would smile upon the city, bringing agricultural fertility and victory in war. In one prayer, King Nabonidus of Babylon, mid-6th century BCE, recalls that the ancient kings of Ur-Nammu and Shulgi had built the ziggurat of Ur long ago, but that over time it had, quote, become old, and on the ancient foundations I rebuilt it with bitumen and baked bricks, as it was in the former times. He then prays to the moon god Sin to enter the temple joyfully and make firm its foundation as heaven. And that shows a continuity of devotion. A king near the end of Mesopotamian independence felt compelled to restore a Bronze Age ziggurat to its past splendor, and he explicitly did so by following a blueprint set by the ancients. So we've certainly covered ziggurats in general, but now let's get a little bit specific. We'll talk about the, most famous examples from the Bronze Age and slightly beyond. Remember that ziggurats aren't just a Bronze Age phenomenon. Of course, each of the great ziggurats embodies the general qualities we've discussed, but there's a unique story to a few of them. So let's continue. First we have the great ziggurat of Ur. It's perhaps the best preserved and maybe the most iconic in what is now southern Iraq. It was built around 2100 by King Ur-Nammu of the 3rd dynasty of Ur. It was dedicated to Nana, who was also called Sin, the moon god and divine patron of Ur. Ur-Nammu's inscriptions proudly declare him the ziggurat's builder, and his son Shulgi claims to have completed it. The ziggurat of Ur was constructed with 3 receding levels, a massive rectangular base and 2 higher platforms, topped by a summit shrine which is now unfortunately lost. Its base measured roughly 64 by 45 meters, and it originally rose to an estimated height of 20 to 30, dominating the city's skyline, of course. Don't have many buildings as high as that in those times. In Sumerian and bore a ceremonial name, E Temenigur, meaning something like temple whose foundation creates aura. And indeed, as the tallest point in a very flat river plain, it certainly would have been awe-inspiring, an almost mystical presence, on a clear day, visible for many miles. Archaeology has revealed impressive facts about Ur's ziggurat. The lower stage as huge square bricks were stamped with Ur-Nammu's name, memorializing him in every layer. The corners of the base were oriented to the cardinal directions, a pretty typical feature likely meant to harmonize the structure with the cosmos. The core of the ziggurat was made of mud brick, but its exterior was layered with fired bricks set in bitumen, forming a durable shell. But even so, by around 1300, which is some 800 or so years after construction, the ziggurat had deteriorated to quite a state. Records indicate that Nabonidus, Babylon's last king, ruling in the 6th century BCE, undertook a major restoration. He rebuilt the upper terraces and refinished the facing, essentially giving new life to the ancient structure. Nabonidus even mentioned finding the inscription of Ur-Nammu when digging into the base, showing how he consciously emulated the original builders. In modern times, the great ziggurat of Ur was excavated in the 20s and 30s. It's 1920s and 30s, so some 100 years ago or so, by the British archaeologist Sir Leonard Woolley. Woolley cleared away centuries of debris to expose the massive foundations and rebuilt the lower staircases. It's thanks to these efforts, and further restoration in the 1980s, that visitors today can walk up the grand stone stairway of Ur's ziggurat, much as ancient priests did 4,000 years ago. And that's pretty cool, don't you think? Very cool. Anyway, the surviving structure stands about 11 to 15 meters high, the first two levels intact, that is. Now, climbing those steps, you can truly sense the scale. I'm yet to do so myself, but I'm using a bit of imagination. The platform looms higher with each step, and one can imagine ascending to another level or two to the original summit. Well, although the top temple is now gone, scholars believed that it housed the idol of Nana, perhaps along with a bed for the deity's comfort and a table for offerings of food. On certain nights, priests may have lit fires or torches at the top, causing the ziggurat to glow under the moonlight, kind of sending a beacon out to Nana himself. But one fascinating aspect of Ur's ziggurat is how it served not just a ritual need, but also administrative ones. Adjacent to it were rooms that likely stored grain, oil, and precious goods collected as offerings or even temple revenue. The ziggurat complex in Ur functioned as a sort of economic hub under the god's auspices. In times of siege or flood, its raised height might even have protected people or supplies. And so it's no wonder that Ur's ziggurat survived the decline of the city. Its massive bulk endured, even as the Euphrates River shifted course. That is, in the 4th century BC, the river change effectively left Ur abandoned and half the city buried in silt, but, well, that's a story for another time, isn't it? Poor old people who bought a house in Ur. Bad luck for them. No refunds, I'm afraid. But to the modern eye, thanks to restorations, the ziggurat of Ur appears as a hulking great pyramid with a stark geometric line structure. But in its heyday, I want you to imagine it with a gleaming whitewashed temple on top. A whole structure, possibly plastered and painted, with banners or bronze fixtures catching the sun. Truly, the pride of Ur, so much that a Sumerian poet once extolled, Ur's ziggurat towers like a mighty bull, its horns in the sky. Today, the wonder stands as a tangible link to the Bronze Age, a testament to human devotion and building skill long before iron or steel. All right, well, the next one. Let's talk a little bit more about a few of the unique aspects of Etemenanke, that is Babylon's great ziggurat, often identified as the inspiration for the Tower of Babel. While the fully realized Etemenanke belongs to the early Iron Age, especially in the Neo-Babylonian period of Nebuchadnezzar II in the 6th century, the origins likely go back to the Bronze Age. Some historians believe that a ziggurat existed in Babylon by the late 2nd millennium BCE, perhaps under the dynasty of Hammurabi, that is the 1700s BC, the one who did the law codes and all the rest, and later rebuilt and enlarged the Ziggurats. Well, by the time of Nebuchadnezzar, this structure was in a ruinous state, buckled up and sunken, according to one Babylonian text. But Nebuchadnezzar claims to have reconstructed it on the ancient foundations, making it as it had been in the good old days. The result was a ziggurat of 7 tiers, reportedly measuring about 91 meters or 300 feet tall, an astonishing height for antiquity, rivaled in the ancient world perhaps only by the Pyramid of Giza, which is 146 meters, smashing the record by about almost 60 meters, but it is what it is, isn't it? Its square base was around 90 meters, which is 300 feet on each side, giving it a footprint larger than a football field. Now, if those figures are accurate, modern scholars debate their height. It's still truly a skyscraper of its era. Now, what about the name Etemenanke? Well, it means the temple of the foundation of heaven and earth, and situated in the center of Babylon, it was part of the Esagila temple complex dedicated to Marduk or Bel, the chief god of the city. Each year during the New Year festival, called Akitu, Babylon's king would climb the stairs as part of a ritual renewal of kingship, a ceremony symbolizing the bond between Marduk and the nation. Ancient sources describe the ziggurat's top shrine as the Epiphany Chamber of Marduk, possibly adorned with a bed and a throne of gold. There the high priest, or even the king in some ceremonies, might spend the night to receive divine messages or omens. And of course, we talked about that consort who was waiting for a rendezvous in that lofty chamber. I won't say too much more about that. Some things are kept private. Well, unfortunately, in archaeological terms, most of Etemenanke is lost. It just has not lasted. The site of Babylon was heavily quarried over centuries. By late antiquity, the ziggurat had been reduced to rubble, and as the story of Alexander showed, the bricks were eventually carted off. So there's a little bit of ziggurat everywhere. Today only a rectangular outline and some remnants of the foundation trenches are still visible. However, a remarkable artifact known as the Tower of Babel's Stele, a stone tablet in the Shoyan collection, carved around 600 BCE, actually depicts a relief of a 7-tier ziggurat with a floor plan, and it bears an inscription by Nebuchadnezzar, detailing how he completed Etemenanke, raising the top to heaven. It provides a visual and textual confirmation of the ziggurat's form. According to that and other records, the first 3 terraces of the tower were painted white, black, and red respectively, perhaps corresponding to certain planetary gods, and the top shrine was a brilliant indigo blue, matching Marduk's celestial association. Etemenanke's fame spread throughout the known world, giving rise to all sorts of accounts. Berosus, a Babylonian priest writing for the Greeks, mentioned it in his histories, and later travelers, like Tavernier, in the 17th century still noted a vast mound at Babel. So in a sense, Etemenanke's cultural height grew even as its physical height shrank. It became the byword for human ambition and divine interaction. For the Babylonians, it symbolized their city's exalted status. For the Israelites in exile, it symbolized the empire's pride. But for modern scholarship, it represents a pinnacle, literally and figuratively, of Mesopotamian architecture and state-sponsored religion. Well, we travel east now into the land of Elam, which is today's Iran, and is there that we find one of the best preserved ziggurats on earth, the impressive structure at Choga Zanbil. In antiquity, the site was called Dur Untash, a holy city founded by King Untash Napirisha around 1250 BCE. Untash Napirisha built the ziggurat at the center of a new sanctuary dedicated to the Elamite god in Shushanak and the goddess Napirisha. Unusually, the ziggurat was not in a dense urban metropolis, but in a special religious city set apart from major population centers, kind of like I suppose, a pilgrimage complex of sorts, if we want to use those terms. In any case, the Choga Zambil ziggurat originally rose in 5 levels and measured about 105 meters or 350 feet on each side at the base, with an estimated height of 50 to 53 meters or 175 feet when complete. These dimensions make it comparable in width to Babylon's tower, though a little bit lower in height. Even today in 2025, or whatever year you're watching, fingers crossed they haven't destroyed it somehow, its ruined remains tower about 25 meters high, essentially the first 3 terraces. They still stand, albeit in their rather decayed form. This ziggurat's state of preservation is due in part to its isolation. Fewer later builders scavenged it, and to the relatively arid climate of Khuzestan. And there is a striking feature at Chogazambil, is that the builders used thousands of baked bricks inscribed with cuneiform texts. Many bricks carry the name Untash Napirisha and the purpose of the building. The design differs slightly from the Mesopotamian ones. It seems to have been a true multi-layered ziggurat from the start. You see, some Mesopotamian ziggurats they began as one story and, well, they just kept adding things later. But this was planned out from start to finish to be multi-leveled. The Elamite architects encased each level with a retaining wall, almost creating a series of nested ziggurats one top of the other. Stairs or ramps on the corners provided access. Reconstructions vary on how exactly one ascended, but we'll hopefully figure that out later. As for the topmost shrine, well, it likely housed the statue of patron deities. In this case, not just one deity, but multiple, since Dur Untash was meant to honor several Elamite gods. In fact, around the base of the ziggurat were temples to various deities. One theory is that Untash Napirisha tried to create a centralized holy site uniting the pantheons of Elam and Mesopotamia. Could be. Well, they also had practical water features, believe it or not. Archaeologists discovered a system of underground conduits and a brick-lined well, possibly meant to collect rainwater or serve for some kind of ritual purification. Despite being built in the late Bronze Age, the site was unfortunately short-lived. Within a few centuries, Elam was not what it used to be. Power waned, and Dur Untash was abandoned. The ziggurat was left to quietly wither away. It wasn't until 1935 that modern explorers, spotting the odd flat-topped mound, realized that it was actually an ancient ziggurat. Excavations in the 50s laid bare this magnificent monument, and today Choga Zanbil is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, allowing us to walk among its age-old bricks. Well, beyond these 3 famous cases, there's a few other ziggurats we should mention. Let's paint a broader picture, just before we go. Near modern Baghdad lie the ruins of a 14th century BC ziggurat built by the Kassite king Kuri Galzu. It is the ziggurat of Akar Kuf, or Dur Kuri Galzu. Its yellow-brown cone still stands about 57 meters high, but in a particularly collapsed state. Pretty prominent landmark. Travelers on the desert highways in Iraq often see this lone towering remnant. Dur Kutukalzu's ziggurat is a reminder that even lesser-known dynasties continued the ziggurat tradition to legitimize their rule, and its solid mass has survived fairly remarkably, though wind erosion has sculpted its sides unevenly. Locals long thought it a natural hill, or even called it Nimrod's Hill, until excavations proved that underneath all that was a well-planned-out ziggurat structure. Then we have the Ziggurat of Ashur. That is, of course, in Assyria's ancient capital, Ashur, in northern Iraq. The chief god Ashur had a temple on a high terrace that functioned like a ziggurat. While Assyrian ziggurats are not as well preserved, often overshadowed by their palaces and statues, texts that we have do tell us that they built multi-tiered temples too. King Sargon II in the 8th century BCE constructed a ziggurat in his new city, Dur-Sharukin, which is what's called Kursabad, that reportedly had 4 stories, painted in different colors. There is a legend, too, that part of Sargon's ziggurat collapsed after his death, viewed by superstitious Assyrians as an omen tied to the king's fate. Good luck proving that one. In any case, it's an example that ziggurats were also built in the Iron Age, carrying on that Bronze Age legacy. What mentioned earlier is the ziggurat of Tepe Sialk in Iran near Kashan. It is the oldest known, dating to the early 3rd millennium BCE. Though now just a weathered clay mound, excavations reveal it had a tiered platform structure. Its discovery pushed back the origin of ziggurats and suggests that even outside of Mesopotamia proper, early societies were experimenting with raised sacred architecture. Sialk's ziggurat might have been contemporary with the earliest Egyptian pyramids, showing a parallel rise of monumental building in separate civilizations. Well, the concept of towering temples wasn't confined to Mesopotamia and Elam, of course. In Syro-Anatolian regions, high place worship also existed, but they didn't really have ziggurats, not exactly. The closest parallels are Ugarit's step temple, or some Hittite sanctuaries built on artificial terraces. And yet they're not really true ziggurats, but it does show a broader Near Eastern idea of height meaning sacred. The higher you get, the more sacred it is. You know what I'm getting at. In later millennia, when Mesopotamian culture was but a memory, we see distant echoes. For instance, some scholars point out that much later the architects of ziggurats in Mesoamerica, and the Maya and Aztec pyramids, by the way, created similar step temples, though any direct connection is highly unlikely. It seems the impulse to build upward in homage to heaven is quite a universal one. Of course, we'll do a video about the South American temples. Those pyramids, those ziggurats, if we're going to call them ziggurats rather than pyramids. I suppose we could, since they were mainly stepped. Anyway. In any case, the through line, I guess, is the symbolic importance of elevation. Whether in a Sumerian city-state in 2100 or an Elamite kingdom in 1250, raising a ziggurat was a connection of divine and civic pride. Of course, they were expensive, labor-intensive, often only undertaken by kings who had the wealth and stability to marshal these sorts of resources. But it was all worth it. Thus the ziggurat also proclaimed, "This city flourishes, not just under the leadership of a king, but the favor of a god, and this is where the god lives, looking down on all of us." It's pretty telling that after the Bronze Age collapse around 1200, some regions saw a lull in ziggurat building, due to upheavals and poverty perhaps. But once things got a little bit better, stability returning in Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian times, rulers immediately revived the grand tradition, as if to say, we are as great as the ancients, and we are back. So, are you Team Ziggurat or Team Pyramid? I don't know. I think if we had a few more ziggurats that lasted like the pyramids did, perhaps we'd be talking about them more. Well, the sands of time do what they do. I'm afraid we can't go back and stop that. Anyway, thank you for listening. I'm going to thank the top tier patrons and supporters. Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Gary, Charlene, Linda Reese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfred, Near, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuronerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Talbury, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Gugu Bonic, Nicholas, Craig, Neftis, Alexander, Gokan, Dorsey, Benita, Claire, Courtesy, Carol, Robert, Mary, Bridget, Nefertari, Yvette, Miss Mochi, 11, Allison, Free American, Jennifer, Brittany, David, Cody, Brian, Are You My Mum, Rhonda, Gary, Katie B, Lovely, Poma, Kevin, Marissa, Altazakin, Lucy, Julianne, Rosie, Tvelo, Chris, Apocalyptic, Brandy, Wolf's Vein, or is it Wolf's Vein? I'm not sure. Dode, Prinny, Aiden, Fabian, and Michael. Thank you so much, and I will see you at the top of the ziggurat. Meet you up there for a cup of tea. Maybe even a beer. I don't think we'll be having a beer at the top of the ziggurat in modern Iraq, but who knows what you'd get away with up there. In any case, that's it from me. Let's all have a good rest, meditate on what we've learned. Lots of love to you all, and see you next time.